Episode 2, Uncertainty Itself.
Dun 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 dun. Start spreading the news. Dun 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 dun. I'm leaving today. Dun 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 dun. I'm going to be a part of it. New York, New York. Dun 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 dun. Except I'm not. The New York Scrum Gathering has been cancelled. Unexpected events have happened unexpectedly. And this is so annoying. For the first time ever, I was organised for this gathering. I booked my flights far, far, far in advance so I could get some good flights at some good prices. And then, gone. It's as Heraclitus said, you can never step in the same river twice. Welcome to our discussion on uncertainty. Alright, uncertainty. Now I've done a few presentations and workshops on this in the past, so I've got some material I'm going to sort of touch upon for this 20 minutes. But first I'd like to start how everyone starts with these types of things, with a dictionary definition, which I'm going to read now off the screen. Uncertainty, the state of being uncertain, doubt or hesitancy, an instance of uncertainty, doubt, etc., or unpredictability, indeterminacy, indefiniteness. Now this does not sound great, but when I asked my wife, who's a bit of an artist, about this, she said, well, uncertainty, that's about open-mindedness, creativity, spontaneity. So there's two sides to it. You know, you could look at uncertainness from a real fear point of view, or you could look at it from a real opportunity point of view. So when I did this presentation, I did it about 5 years ago now, I think, I sort of broke uncertainty up into three major chunks. The first chunk was uncertainty in content, right? Now, what did I mean by that? Well, there's the famous phrase, at the start of a project, you know the least about a project you will ever know about a project. Or as I've heard it said, through the act of creation, you discover more. As we go from the cone of uncertainty down, you know, from inception, where estimates are wide-ranging, down through elaboration, construction, etc., getting tighter and more refined as we go along, historically and hysterically, we've made all our commitments up front at the start when there's been high variance in them, and actually we should be making decisions further down when we get a better understanding of what the work is. And so for me, it's not so much that cone of uncertainty, you know, coming in, you know, wide ranging in. It's more a cone of discovery. That's the idea for me. The idea of as we journey through this experience, we discover more and more and more about the experience. So the entire point of Agile really is to deal with uncertainty of content, you know. So we do tricks to handle the fact that content's going to change. We focus on value early to try and make sure we don't build all the fundamental foundations and no actual return on investment. We build in small lumps to reduce risk, to give us the chance to get flexibility. Yet historically, uncertainty's been seen to be a really, really bad thing. You know, I remember Kevin MacLeod of the UK TV show Grand Designs saying that would be cheaper to fix with a pencil. Now what he meant by that was Grand Designs, a TV show, if you haven't seen it, it's on YouTube, it's all over the internet. For 20 odd seasons, people have a grand design of a house they're going to build. They plan to build it. It always goes over time. It always goes over budget. And they always seem to gain an extra child after Kevin MacLeod's visited. I'm not claiming anything. I want to make it quite clear. He probably had nothing to do with all these extra children. Probably. But the idea is that it's easier to fix with a pencil. It's easy to fix on a blueprint. It's very hard to fix when it becomes concrete. So every single episode of that show, something goes wrong because they're changing content throughout the delivery as they discover more about the work through empiricism. That is life. Okay, and we get exactly the same problem in our traditional software development lifecycle. You know, all the analysis up front, all the design up front, all the testing and verification at the end has been a classic problem. And so the Agile thing fixes that, right? Right? Let's now look at uncertainty in method. Okay, now let's look at uncertainty in method. Now, hopefully, most of you appreciate that Agile is not just one thing. Beyond it being a culture or mindset, it's also a collection of practices, processes, approaches, frameworks, methods, and tools. And so the uncertainty is quite interesting there already. Like, which method do we choose? Which tool do we take on? Which framework or which approach do we adopt under that Agile umbrella? So already there's some variability there that some people don't appreciate. But it's more interesting than that. It's not just the variability between methods, it's actually the variability in methods. If we look at something like Cynefin from Dave Snowden, the complexity model I'll try and put on screen somewhere, a clear, complicated, complex, chaotic or confused is the model we use these days. But if you look at that, most Agile work lives in the complicated or complex space. And so thus there is no such thing as a best practice in that particular world. There are good practices, there may be emergent practices or even novel practices. And thus it's very dangerous to assume that you can have one size fits all across an organisation. I see this too often. Organisations experiment with Agile, they experiment with these approaches, they understand they've got to discover their own shape, and then they copy and paste that shape across all their other teams. Ouch, we have to avoid this. It is not one size fits all. We've got to discover the best practices, probably team to team across the experience. That's a lot of experimentation. We can use expert advice, but we've also got to take it with a slight pinch of salt. So let's look at the over methodologization of Agile. Try saying that when you're drunk. Let's look at the over methodologization of Agile. That's better. I see that happen too much all over the place. People creating cookbooks, creating recipes, trying to simplify complex ideas and then trying to copy and paste that to increase the speed of learning or reduce down the need to learn in large organizations. No, I'm not going to blame any one particular method for this. Safe. But the idea of things like Scrum and Kanban is they're meta methods to allow you to inspect and adapt. They're not good practices, they're practices to help you find your good practices. That sort of meta thinking is really important in the Agile space, and I feel some of the scaling approaches or just Agile at scale in general seems to miss out on that a little bit or not fully appreciate that. That methodologization could lead to almost a calcification of process as it becomes ossified and becomes stiff by the very cookbooks that were supposed to assist it. But my other concern in this space is ossification, calcification. No, look back to the definition of uncertainty. Things like hesitancy and doubt. My concern is actually uncertainty, unsureness, bringing around a half-assed Agile approach. Have a look at this. Remember this, the manifesto for half-assed Agile software development. Originally the concept comes from Ron Jeffries, an ex-colleague of mine, Carrie Buckley's the person who put it on the internet. It's hilarious. It is what Agile looks like in many, many companies across the world, where they water our principles and our practices down to effectively end up with homeopathy. Right, Martin Fowler, one of the signatories of the Agile Manifesto, famously called a flavour of this flaccid Scrum. Scrum where you can't inspect and adapt your process and your practice is not Scrum at all. That's scum as far as I'm concerned. This is why the filling of those meta frameworks is crucial, and there are some really good practices we could use. We've got to be very careful of Agile meaning anything, thus anything goes. Like, I'm a huge fan of extreme programming and using those approaches in a software development context. I feel they're exciting, I feel their time has come, and we should really be looking to embrace those again. Another way of handling this situation is trying to put some controls around uncertainty, and that's classically done with the old definition of done concept, or defining done. What is done? Now, I don't want to get too much into that in this video. I hope to theme an entire video around done, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, so hold that thought for now. What I would say is some tricks people use to reduce uncertainty, things like a definition of ready, for instance, for some people could be a marvellous practice, and for others it could be a terrible practice. It could be an anti-pattern that would actually damage their experience. So we've got to be a little bit careful with this. Even in the area of trying to reduce uncertainty, there is very few best practices, but quite a few good practices that could decay into bad over time. That's something called the Nigel scale. That's going to be a future video as well. Let's move on. Okay, let's look at another way to try and reduce uncertainty, or at least not reduce it, but harness it or surf uncertainty. And that would be user stories. A great way to get closer, deeper conversation, communication between the needs and the people creating the answers to those needs. What a great tool, what a great method. Most of us use user stories in some format or another across our teams. Yet again, this is an area where we sometimes see faux certainty causing problems. You've all seen the famous Connextra formula. As someone, I want something so that I achieve some result. You may have seen Jim Shaw's famous one, as a software developer, I'm doing it wrong because I think this template is a replacement for talking to people. Even in that area, card, conversation, confirmation, people often focus on the confirmation part, the reducing uncertainty part, and not on the exploring of uncertainty, the conversation itself. And this is why I am not a fan of Jira. Now, I know everyone laughs, Nigel hates Jira, ha ha ha. I've got a cookbook, a portfolio of Jira jokes, but I don't hate it for any reason beyond it just seems to be a calcification of other people's good practice into some sort of faux best practice for you. It seems to wrap loads of bad practices into good practices by mistake, and it's just a tool that doesn't ease communication. You've all heard the famous line, Jira, where stories go to die. And the joke is, it's not a joke. It happens to a lot of us. Now, having said that, it's not Atlassian's fault. I see some really funky tools being where stories go to die as well. So things like Trello, version 1, etc., over the years can be all used inappropriately. Now they say, a fool with a tool is still a fool. You need to get your behaviour driving the tool, not the tool driving your behaviour. I understand all that. It's just some tools tend to take us down the dark path far quicker and far easier with a far steeper gradient than other tools. So be careful with them. They may help you feel like you're reducing uncertainty or controlling uncertainty, but that may be a false reassurance. So remember, the entire point about Agile is Agile, adaptiveness, suppleness, the ability to change when changing conditions occur. And a lot of people these days, again, are writing about things about speed, about performance, about getting more for less. And really, the idea of Agile is more for less is great, but the ability to change when you learn more, that's crucial. I think what we'll get is more learning and less pointless work. Let's look at uncertainty then in one area where people crave certainty. Estimation. How does that work for us? Look where I started with Scrum, nearly 20 years ago now. We started off estimating in quite granular detail, ideal days, down into like hours in our sprints, because we wanted that faux assurance. We felt we needed that. And over time, during the history of Agile as a movement, it's kept moving. And there's been a gradual thinning of the estimation process. Some of us these days work with the story point concept, but for a lot of people, that's now passé. They've moved on even further. I always liked estimate ranges, but understand how practically they're so difficult to make work because of psychological issues like priming and anchoring. So the no estimate movements appeared, which I think is fascinating, though in my appreciation, it's not really not estimating, is it? It's more like counting stories. But still, chopping all your stories up into even-sized blocks or even-ish sized blocks and counting is a very, very powerful technique. So the idea of ranges and points and no estimate movement, counting stories, these are all things to introduce a level of uncertainty to an approach that pretended to be very faux certain for a long time, and then using other techniques to better manage that uncertainty, like prioritization. I see a time where sprint goals become huge again, where we have this big hairy goal, 2 weeks to hit that challenge, and teams can innovate and explore and get away from these small feature slices that some of us have moved to over the last few years. That could be interesting, couldn't it? The idea of exploration in a sprint rather than being exploiting during a sprint. And then we come to things like uncertainty in person. Now, When I say uncertainty in person, I don't mean like uncertainty in roles, like really shitty Scrum or something. Hey, because of the power of self-organization, I'm going to self-organize myself into being product owner, Scrum master, Agile coach, line manager, and your king, and I'll call myself an Agile project manager. That's not what I mean. And I don't mean uncertainty in person, i.e. in terms of confusion or ignorance, but it could be like a change of the balance of the roles. How much should a product owner do? How much should a team do? That varies depending on the relationship between those people, the skill sets of that whole Scrum team. That doesn't have to be one size fits all. I've worked with some teams where the product owner has been very much a subject matter expert and the team have been very much outsourced workers. And I've also worked in experiences where the team know all about the product and the product owner is very light touch indeed, just saying, hey, give me something cool by Christmas, and the team go off and fulfill those needs. So that's a way of looking at uncertainty in person, and could be about self-organization, different roles taking on different responsibilities, different power, contributing different content, which is very different to just destroying the role concept and having malformed traditional leadership in there. But there's another way of looking at this as well, and it touches back to the first episode. But as an Agile coach, you can't have all the answers, you won't have all the answers, you shouldn't have all the answers. An Agile coach has to embrace uncertainty, embrace that they don't know everything. The same things with leadership, the same thing with product owners, the same thing with development teams. We need to talk a little bit how we can embrace uncertainty as people. Now, some people can embrace uncertainty because that's who they are. They love a bit of gamble. They're the risk takers. I'm afraid to say that's not me. Some people are a little bit Buddhist, a little bit Zen. They can embrace the inherent troubles of the universe. All things pass. Everything will be all right in the end. If it's not all right, it's not the end. Well, I'm definitely feeling that at the moment with the situation we're in around the world. But again, I'm not totally that person. I may look like Buddha, but I have to say I don't necessarily have that ability to let go of the universe. How do I better handle it? Well, for me, I embrace uncertainty by locking down a few other things for myself. If you think of the SCARF model by David Rock, he said people have these 5 attributes that can really set them off, either positively or negatively, sort of lizard brain attributes. SCARF: status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness and fairness. Well, for me, if certainty is going to be affected, and I find that very emotionally difficult, I need to reinforce the other stuff. I need to feel like I have a good status, feel like I have autonomy, professionalism, adultness, feel like I'm part of a team, relatedness, feel like we're all being treated fairly, fairness. By getting those other things in place, that better helps me to handle uncertainty. It may be for you as well. Or just be the gambler, or be Zen. But something in that space. Or purity, that's another way. Some people find the purity, like the passion for the movement, is what keeps them going in very difficult situations. But having this sense of passion, this sense of purity, this sense of purpose, that sense of purpose really motivates them through sticky settings in work. To finish up, Bertrand Russell said, "The trouble with the world today," when he was talking about the late 30s, "is that fools are so sure of themselves and the wise are so full of doubts." So for me, uncertainty is a tool in our toolbox, not something to be fought, but something to be embraced, something to be surfing on that wave of uncertainty. If we can do that as humans, if we can do that as people, we can then better do that in methods. And if we can do that in methods, we can better do that in content. Uncertainty in a nutshell for me. Is that everything? Do you know what? I'm not sure. But I think it's enough for today. Don't you? Thank you for joining me. Again, this has been a really interesting one, revisiting this topic for myself. I hope it's been good for you. The next episode is going to come next week. The schools are shut, so we may have some special guests for my 2 little daughters. But we'll see. See you next week. Take care. Have a good weekend. Goodbye.
Next episode on the Age of Uncertainty, the Nigel Scale.